The inverter gave a final, sharp click and died. The hum of the cooling fan vanished, and the overhead light blinked out, leaving the room in an instant, suffocating darkness. Vikram sat at the heavy teak table, his laptop screen the only island of light in the sudden void. He blinked, waiting for the backup to kick in, but the silence remained absolute. It did not just settle, it solidified. Outside, the sub-zero wind of the Himachal ranges slammed against the bungalow. It whipped through the ancient deodar trees, a low, guttural roar that sounded like an assembly of giants clearing their throats. Vikram pushed his chair back, the movement scraping harshly against the stone tiles. The cold crept in through the window frames, a biting, invisible presence that turned his breath into thin plumes of mist. He looked at the window. The glass rattled under the pressure of the mountain gale. He had come here to write, to find a story in the isolation. But the mountain was not waiting for him to begin. It was already speaking. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white, listening to the forest clawing at the walls of the house. A voice rasped from the shadows near the kitchen door, cutting through the wind. Vikram jumped, his chair scraping loudly against the stone tiles as he spun toward the sound. It was Kundan Lal, the caretaker. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, carrying a brass lantern that smelled of sharp kerosene. The yellow flame danced behind soot-stained glass, casting long, erratic shadows that climbed the walls. Vikram rubbed his sand-filled eyes, the transition from his bright screen to the dim room leaving him disoriented. "There's no point looking for the network, Sahib," the old man said, his voice like grinding stone. Vikram hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I was not checking the network, Kundanji. The silence up here is just heavy." Kundan Lal set the lantern down on the teak table. The light warped the laptop screen into a distorted mirror, reflecting Vikram's own pale, wide-eyed expression. "The silence is only heavy when you are trying to listen to what is hidden inside it," the caretaker replied, staring into the dark. "In the plains, you live in noise because you are terrified of what the earth says when it is quiet." Vikram shifted, seeing the potential for his screenplay, but the cold in the room felt sharper now. Vikram leaned forward, the chill in the air sinking into his bones. "And what does the earth say here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kundan Lal walked to the window, his heavy wool wrap trailing like a dark shroud. He looked out into the void where the trees stood, like jagged teeth. "Here, the trees grow away from what is buried beneath them," he replied. "Tonight is Krishna Paksha Ashtami. The border between worlds is thin like wet paper." Vikram reached for his notepad, but his hand froze. The temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath bloomed in the air, escaping in thick, ghostly plumes that hung before them. Kundan Lal turned, and for a heartbeat, the lantern light caught his eyes, bleaching them until they looked like solid, sightless marble. Vikram felt a jolt of primal fear, his muscles locking in place. "Listen closely," the caretaker rasped, leaning over the table until his face was inches from Vikram's. "And do not look behind you while I speak. The forest has 3 faces, and tonight it will show you all of them." The warning hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute, as the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch toward the table. Kundan Lal did not blink. He began to speak of a time when the slopes were called Trishul-Ghat, a place where people left their shadows behind. In 1944, a landlord named Chandreshwar Rai arrived with the singular ambition to carve a timber mill into the heart of the mountains. The village priest stood at the edge of the clearing, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the ancient, towering deodars. He warned that the roots held down a mouth waiting to scream, that the earth here was not meant to be broken. Chandreshwar did not listen. He laughed at the old man, calling the fear mere superstition, and gestured for his men to start the engines. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Birds fell silent. Even the wind died down, leaving the air unnaturally still as the heavy steel saws were dragged into the grove. Chandreshwar paced the perimeter, his eyes locked on the oldest tree, his fingers drumming against his belt. He ignored the priest's final frantic prayer, signaling his men to begin the cut. The first roar of the machinery shattered the silence, a mechanical intrusion that felt like a desecration. The forest had been warned, but the saws were already biting into the wood. The saw bit deep into the deodah. It did not whine or spark. It groaned. A heavy, wet, tearing sound echoed through the clearing as the blade sliced through the heartwood. Then, the machine sputtered and choked on something thick. A dark, viscous fluid began to weep from the cut, pooling on the forest floor with a sharp, metallic stench of old iron and dried blood. Chandreshwar pushed his men aside, his impatience giving way to confusion. He grabbed an axe and struck the trunk again, a violent, desperate blow. The wood did not shatter. It peeled away like dead skin. Inside the hollow core, nested in the rotting fibers, sat a gilded Trishul. It was massive, jagged, and cold. Impaled upon its 3 prongs were human skulls, their jaws locked in silent, eternal screams. The sight halted the clearing. The men stepped back. The engines died, and the wind simply vanished. The forest did not just stop moving. It ceased to exist. Total, suffocating silence descended, heavy as a burial shroud. Chandreshwar reached out, his fingers trembling, and closed his grip around the cold golden metal of the trident. As his palm made contact, the ground shuddered. The moment Chandreshwar touched the cold gold, his shadow detached. It did not fade. It tore itself from the forest floor like wet ink. It stood upright, stretching until it loomed twice his height. Chandreshwar tried to scream, but the shadow moved faster, plunging a black, solid hand deep into his chest. His skin turned to gray ash, crumbling away as the darkness poured into his hollowed-out frame. He stood up, but the movement was wrong, too fluid, too elastic. He returned to the bungalow, but he was no longer the man who had left it. Within days, the servants were gone. The house went cold. When the officials finally forced the doors open, the rooms were empty, silent, and rotting. They found him in the cellar. He was pinned to the stone floor with heavy, rusted railway spikes driven through his hands and feet. His tongue had been cut out, a jagged, wet wound. On the cellar wall, written in thick, drying human fat, was a single word: unsatisfied. The forest had claimed its debt, and the bungalow had become its tomb. The air in the room grew heavy, stale with the memory of that ancient, lingering hunger. Vikram blinked, the harsh blue light of his laptop screen suddenly stinging his eyes. He looked down. The battery indicator flashed a jagged red icon. 10% remaining. As the screen dimmed, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching across the floorboards toward his feet. He felt a bead of sweat track down his spine, cold and sharp. "That is a good story," Vikram said, his voice cracking. "But it is just a legend. High-altitude psychosis. Nothing more." Kundanlal chuckled. A sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the far end of the room, where a heavy wooden door sat flush against the wall. "You city people think naming a demon makes it safe. If it was just madness, why is the cellar door still sealed with 7 iron bolts?" Vikram looked. He had walked past that door a dozen times, assuming it was for coal or storage. Now, in the fading light, he saw the iron. 7 thick, rusted bolts, each hammered deep into the stone casing. They were not designed to keep things in. They were installed to keep the cellar from ever opening again. The air in the room plummeted. Vikram gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white. Kundanlal did not wait for an answer. He leaned back into the shadows, his face obscured by the flickering lantern light. He spoke of the 70s, of 3 meteorologists stationed in a reinforced bunker deep within the range. The storm that winter was not merely weather. It was a wall of white, burying the world and silencing the radio. By the 14th night, the blizzard had locked them inside. The metal walls groaned under the pressure of the shifting snow, vibrating with every gust. Inside, the men sat in the dim light of a single kerosene stove. Then, the sound arrived. It did not come from the gale outside. It came from the heavy iron door leading into the storm. Thud. A pause. Thud. The sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy, like something dense striking the metal. The three men stopped moving. They stared at the door. Thud. The vibration rattled the tea tins on the shelves. It was not the wind. It was not ice falling from the roof. Something was standing on the other side of that door, waiting for an invitation. The silence between the knocks grew longer, tighter, until the air in the room became difficult to breathe. Ramesh did not move. He kept his hand clamped over the lantern, his eyes wide and fixed on the iron bolt. The knocking ceased, replaced by a voice from the other side. It was not a monster's growl. It was the voice of the youngest meteorologist, pleading for entry. But the man was sitting right there, his mouth clamped shut, his face drained of color. The child had stolen his tone, his rhythm, his very breath. The men sat paralyzed, listening to their own voices, begging to be let inside. Kundan Lal paced the room, the lantern light casting long, distorted shapes on the wall. He explained the endgame. The creature did not kill the body. It hollowed it out. It took the voice, then the movements, then the identity. The victim remained inside, pushed into a corner of their own consciousness, a silent, immobile observer watching the entity use their hands to touch their family, use their mouth to speak their secrets. Every gesture, every laugh, every word was a theft. As the entity entered, the original consciousness became a ghost in its own skin, unable to scream, unable to signal for help. It sat there, a prisoner in a cage of bone, forever trapped as the mimic played their life like a stolen instrument. Vikram stood up, but his knees did not buckle. They remained locked, rigid, as if held by invisible iron wires. He tried to shout, but his throat felt lined with dry silt, his own voice sounding distant, like a recording played in another room. He looked at the laptop screen. The battery icon flickered once, then vanished into a black void. Kundan Lal did not move. He stood by the kitchen door, his lantern flame dying down to a pinprick of light. The caretaker was no longer whispering. He was watching. Vikram felt a sudden, cold pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of being pulled backward into the dark recesses of his own skull. He tried to lift his hand to the table, but the limb moved with a jerky, elastic rhythm that was not his own. The forest outside had stopped its howling. The trees were leaning against the glass, pressing inward. "You listened," Kundan Lal said, his voice now sounding exactly like Vikram's own. "You paid attention." The room grew colder, the light from the lantern extinguished, and Vikram felt himself slipping, sliding into the corner of his own mind, a silent, sightless prisoner as his own hand reached out to grasp the pen.